Hey everyone, and welcome to Seriously Risky Business, the podcast we do here at Risky Business HQ, which focuses on cyber policy and intelligence matters. My name is Patrick Gray. Today, we'll be speaking with our cyber policy and intelligence editor, Tom Uren, about the work he's done for us this week in preparing his Seriously Risky Business newsletter, which you can find at news.risky.biz. And of course, before we get going, we need to thank the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for supporting Tom's work with us, and also Lawfare Media, who help us out. And we also have a sponsor this week, which is Trail of Bits, which is a very well-regarded cybersecurity engineering firm, based mostly in the United States. So big thanks to those guys. And you can hear a conversation with Dan Guido further back a few podcasts in the Risky Business News RSS feed. And I recommend you check that one out. Tom Uren joins me now. G'day, Tom. How are you?
G'day, Patrick. How are you?
Good. So we've been over your newsletter, which is about to go out. You've covered a few very interesting topics here. One that we touched on briefly in yesterday's main Risky Business podcast was this Microsoft report that looked at China and Russia's continuing and accelerating use of criminal tools and actual criminal people to achieve sort of state objectives in cyber. You've done a bit more of a deep dive on that one than we had a chance to. So, what was your take on all of this?
Yeah, so the Microsoft report says basically, here's all this evidence that Russia is using cybercriminal groups. And it sort of rang a bell in that I think early September, this CISA advisory came out and said that the GRU, their sabotage and assassination unit, had sort of, I think the phrase they used was expanded their tradecraft into destructive cyber operations. And in the description, it says that one of the ways they'd done that was just getting junior people, hands on keyboard, actually like suck it and see, try it out, see how you go, learn on the job. But the second way was that they were recruiting cyber criminals. And it just struck me that the sort of people who go around murdering people maybe aren't by inclination the best people to conduct cyber operations, but they'd probably be bloody good at convincing cyber criminals that you hack for us or else.
Yes. Hello, I'm an assassin and thug. I'd like you to do something for me. I mean, it's a pretty compelling pitch right there, right?
Yeah, now that struck me as like very interesting, but it didn't seem like a broader strategy. But now all of a sudden you've got all these pieces where across the board Russian forces are getting cyber criminals to actually do the work. So back in April, there was evidence from Mandiant that they were buying services, but that seems to have evolved, and now they're either coercing or perhaps even buying, time, paying them to do stuff. And there's another piece of evidence: the Ukrainian
CIP.
Their cybersecurity authority said that there's a law enforcement group, former law enforcement in Luhansk, who are conducting cyber operations. And again, this feels the same to me. Like, former police in a regional part of Ukraine, probably not the best hackers, but they probably know who the criminals are and have some leverage over them. So to me, this feels like you've got different organizations doing it. So the GRU's doing it. The Microsoft report says that the group they indicate is linked to the FSB. And then you've got this occupied Ukrainian group doing it. So that feels like it's a strategy rather than
just it popping up by itself in a couple other places. I mean, I totally got what you mean. And I think, to me, this is just a really interesting sign of the times. And keep in mind, Russia's doing this at a time when there's a lot of reporting going on that there are North Korean military personnel being deployed to fight or at least support Russian military efforts targeting Ukraine. So it sort of has a bit of a whiff of desperation about it, if I'm honest. But wartime produces some pretty weird outcomes a lot of the time. But I guess the reason I find it so interesting and such an interesting sign of the times is that when you look at how various countries have stood up their sort of cyber-enabled intelligence units, I'm thinking back to China, and this was a point I made yesterday as well, which is, China really did a great job of recruiting from the pools of like nationalist hackers in China, people who were all fired up on national fervor, brought them into the state, gave them their government IDs, made them government employees. So it seemed like for a while the trend was about formalizing, the whole thing, and now it's kind of going in the other direction because times are a bit tough. What are your thoughts on that in terms of it being a sort of reversal of the normal trend?
To me, it seems just a very practical response to what's going on, and the operational requirements. Like, they need hackers, they need them quick. To recruit them traditionally just takes time. So, you can have a talent pipeline, but traditionally for a cyber operator, that's quite long. And so you want to speed that up. And if they're probably doing that as well, my understanding is that they've expanded the number of teams dramatically. But then you've also got this pool of, I'll call it skilled labour, who can motivate people in other ways. So you're taking a sort of complementary resource, which is basically thuggery, and you're converting that into cyber capability. So that's it's taking a different approach totally to achieving the same end. So in a way, it's like quite an innovative solution.
Well, this sort of I can't call this sort of thuggery innovative, Tom. You know what I mean? Like, threatening people with a lead pipe to go and do what you want is not really that sophisticated in my mind.
I think it's bureaucratically innovative. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the lead pipe, that's been around for a long time.
Yeah, the lead pipe can usually achieve quite a lot. But I guess, the point is this veneer of like doing things in a legitimate or sort of ordinary way, like that's just gone now, They don't care.
Did they ever care? I mean, I think what happens is that bureaucracies operate the way they operate, and it takes a push to get them to do something different. And in this case, the push is we really need more people, and we want to expand. And so I think it's probably something like, the GRU did it. They went, we want to be able to cyber blow up stuff, not just have to travel and blow up stuff. And other groups went, oh, hey, that looks like a good idea. And the way they did that was finding their captive criminals and getting them to do the work.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Criminals as a resource, I guess. Excuse me. Now, another thing that you've written up here is a report from OpenAI. It's their Influence in Cyber Operations report. And it's got some interesting stuff in it, even though it is maybe a little bit too exculpatory, as in like, no one's doing anything bad with OpenAI. You and I work with a contract editor on the newsletter, and the contract editor, who is not a cyber domain expert, read that and thought, oh, it just looks like there's sort of whitewashing their own culpability in this domain. You and I both said, no, they're probably playing it with a straight bat. But still, that's a valid question. So First of all, why don't you walk us through what the report actually said and what it actually is setting out to achieve? And then we can get into those details about whether or not we think they're just trying to say, nothing to see here.
So it's OpenAI's influence and covert operations update. So they've produced a few of them. In this case, they look at how, did I say covert? I meant cyber and influence operations update. And so they looked at cyber operations, how are malicious actors using OpenAI models to try and supercharge their cyber operations, and similarly how they're using it to supercharge influence operations, which in this case means basically social media operations. So when it comes to cyber, they've got this whole list of different things that different actors are trying to do. So reconnaissance, vulnerability research, social engineering, software development and scripting. So all of those, it seems like, you might be better off just using a search engine for some of the questions. Some of them, the questions they asked, I think they asked ChatGPT in this case, were like, I think betrayed a lack of sophistication. So some were like, basically, how do you use SQL map? Which seemed like, well, if you really knew what you were doing, you would not ask a model how to
Well, even
do
if you
that.
halfway know what you're doing, you probably know how to use SQL map.
Exactly.
Right? So,
Yeah. Well, I have used it. I can't remember. Is it SQL map -- help? It might help. It might be better than. But mostly the take home there was they're using it. It's probably not much better than anything else you could use that's already available. So AI is no great help there. The influence operations were somewhat more interesting. Mostly they found that they're trying to use LLMs to manage personas or create content. And it seems like there's the potential for automation there. But in all the cases they found, the output or the content wasn't having a huge impact on on how successful those operations were.
Well, I mean, AI-generated text is universally really boring and dry. You know,
Yes.
it just is, right? Like, it's not exactly engaging stuff. And I just don't think those models are good at that yet. I mean, one thing that I found really interesting is, you know, you've had X release its sort of very unfiltered AI, and you could generate images that violate all sorts of copyrights and whatever, which has been a bit of a wild time. But there has been some funny stuff happen. It hasn't quite played out how I expected. So we did see a AI-generated image, and I'm sure you would have seen it on social media, of a little girl in floodwaters holding a puppy, looking like she was about to cry. It's, you know, a heartbreaking image, and clearly AI-generated. But it was so obviously AI-generated and over the top that people started AI generating like photos of the puppy carrying her, and you know what I mean? Like, it actually got quite funny. So I think, you know, a lot of this we're discussing in the context of the upcoming presidential election in the United States.
Yep.
And, you know, I don't think the tech is at the point right now where it presents a credible threat to the sort of information environment, right? Like, I think we've kind of, at least for this cycle, we've dodged this being a significant threat.
Yeah, so I haven't seen that picture of the girl and the puppy.
I'll send it to you later with all of the other ones as well. It's funny.
It seems to me that if that reflected something that was politically, is salient the right word? If for some reason it was, you know, so-and-so has totally mismanaged the disaster relief effort.
Well, I think that was the gist that they were going for. Yeah,
that kind of picture could take off, but it doesn't have to be AI generated. Like, it could be a real picture. Yeah. It sort of speaks to what's going on, and it's not no one's purporting that it's a real picture.
It's not some magical special sauce that makes something succeed that otherwise would have failed, I think is your point. Yeah.
I think if that picture was going to succeed, it would succeed regardless of whether it was AI generated or not.
Yeah, and I think, though,
like,
you know, what you said...
political messaging.
Yeah, and what you said about content at scale, I mean, we're just being flooded with so much AI-generated content at the moment that it just doesn't cut through. You know, I just don't think it has... I think the stuff that cuts through, there's always something unique, something brief, you know what I mean? That it's like a headline. You know, really, like a headline is what gets people. It's these short messages, and AI sucks at that. So, I mean, I guess we keep an eye on those reports and see if it changes. I have a feeling we'll be in a different place in, 2028. What do you think?
What I think is really important is that OpenAI did the report at all.
Yes.
So it's only one of a number of companies, and as far as I know, it's the only one that does that style of report. I think that's very useful for people to know exactly what's going on. So I'd like to see more of these reports. I think it's an ever-changing field, and so if we had a variety of reports, we would be in a better place in the future. And partly that would be, like, my guess is that we would be more confident that it's not going to end the world because it's so good at creating stuff. That's where I think and I hope we'll end up. But when it's just OpenAI, a single company producing those reports, it's like, well, yeah, I don't know.
Well, and the question is too, and I nearly moved on from this segment without asking this question, which I previewed when we first started speaking about it, is, do you think this is a whitewash? Do you think this is just OpenAI, trying to, make themselves look like, oh, nothing to see here? Personally, I don't. I feel like they've played this with a pretty straight bat.
I think they had a lot of evidence in the report that felt realistic and convincing.
They're showing their work, I guess.
Yeah. I also think that if there was other stuff going on, there's enough people looking for it that people would find it, and we'd eventually hear the stories of how it had been used in a malicious way successfully.
Yeah.
Those stories aren't happening yet. So you've sort of got the two sides. The report seems realistic, and there's no counter narrative that seems authentic or realistic right now.
Yeah.
Counter evidence is probably a better word.
All right, so let's just turn down the cynicism a notch on that one. And we got one last thing we're talking about this week, which is a, excuse me again, a bit of a cybersecurity bill in Australia that contains three things. And it looks like an eminently sensible bit of legislation. And it's funny because, you know, we cover a lot of US-based news and we rarely talk about proposed legislation in the US because stuff gets proposed all the time and then never goes anywhere. In Australia, It's a bit different. By the time, you know, the major party that holds power is proposing a bill, you know, unless it's something really politically controversial, you can, you know, bet dollars to donuts that it's going to become law. So I think the odds of this one getting up are pretty high. But why don't you walk us actually through the bill here? Because there's a few components. There's ransomware payment reporting, incident reporting, and also they're going to establish like a Australian equivalent to a CSRB, like a incident review board, basically.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about it, there's, like you said, only three things. Companies have to report ransomware if they're big enough. So there's a revenue threshold. There's a few, exceptions for companies that already have to do it, so you don't double up on the law. It just struck me as like cybersecurity authorities have complained about this for years and years and years. We don't have good evidence of what's going on, and it's just, just impose a law. There's some protections if you tell the government they can't use that information for other purposes. So if you've been committing crimes, the information can only be used for cybersecurity purposes.
Yeah. But that said, you can't just have a gigantic incident reported to the government and think that, you know, absolves you of any sort of future problems, right? Like if you think of like the Optus or the Medibank hacks, just because you report it doesn't mean that it's not going to still be a problem.
That's right. It's not a get out of jail free card, but the regulators who might want to investigate have to do their own work. So they can't leverage what's already been handed to the government. So that seems pretty sensible. Okay, you're trying to strike a balance there. Seems like a good move. Now, the second thing they want to do is set up the equivalent of the US Cyber Safety Review Board. So the trick here is that the US is basically central to the internet, and the US has a large number of very, very important tech companies. So one of the roles the CSRB has taken is to actually basically carry a stick and at times basically berate companies for poor behavior. The classic example, which I really like, is that it talked about Microsoft's cascade of security failures, you know, a real wake-up call. So Australia's not in that situation at all. So it's very much focused on learning from what's gone on, how companies ended up in that space, what the vulnerability was, but also how the government and industry responded afterwards. So there've been a number of large breaches where there's been a whole of government response, and there's no real, there has been no report that's been publicly available which steps all the way through. What could we all have done better? And so I think that'd be really useful.
I do think, even though we don't have the US tech industry based here, right? Like, fine.
Yep.
We're not, it's not going to carry the same impact. Like, we'll get less cooperation out of Microsoft too if we're investigating something involving Microsoft. I understand that. But I still think Australia has one thing going for it, even though we're a small country, you know, large country with a small population, is that Australia is credible. So I think a report from a board like this in Australia that really takes a baseball bat to a vendor that isn't even based here, I don't think that necessarily matters. I think if the reports are good and there's that credibility there, I think it could still actually move the needle, if I'm honest. Because initially I had the same reaction as you, which is like, it won't have all the same impacts. And I think, that's largely true, but I don't think it's meaningless. If I'm honest.
I would agree. I think these kind of reports can say with evidence what everyone is thinking.
Yes.
And when you do that, it's like it does become a talking point, a stick that you can use. You can point to it. here's all the evidence. It's public, which I think is very useful. So this one, it also tries to strike the balance. So the board can't assign blame, and its final report, the word in the legislation is, it cannot provide the means to determine the liability of any entity in relation to a cybersecurity incident.
Yeah.
So there's going to have to be some very fine wordsmithing in that final report. I'm very curious to see how that turns out.
We're not proposing a new regulator here. Hey, that's crazy, I think is what they're saying. What do you mean? You're not going to get in trouble. But they also, unlike the US board, they're going to have powers to compel, aren't they?
That's right. So they have to ask nicely first, and if an entity involved in an incident doesn't respond, they can compel production of documents. So I think that's
under threat of, I imagine, under threat of fines, right?
Yeah, the fines aren't huge, but I think the point is, I think it's a reputational risk more than anything else. If you have a huge disaster and then you, I guess in the Australian vernacular, pull up stumps and go away and don't talk to the board, it just looks terrible.
Or in the American sense, we could say if you circle the wagons. See?
Yeah.
We're inclusive here. We got metaphors for everyone.
Yep. Idiom for every language.
That's right. That's right. But yeah, I mean, look, all in all, though, I think the takeaway here is that it looks like a sensible law, and one where, countries like Australia, countries like certain European countries and whatever, they can bring in these laws, and it's not a huge lift. Whereas, you look at the political landscape in a place like the United States, and you want to bring in something like minimum standards, or for IoT, which is one of those things here. I can't even remember where that is in America, but like even just introducing mandatory reporting in a country like the United States is a pretty heavy lift.
Yeah, that's right. This really made me just sort of think about the differences between the two political systems, where everyone goes, okay, yeah, this seems a good idea, and it gets pushed through, even if there probably is some pushback somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, there's probably going to be a few little red pens come out and some minor changes here and there, you would imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it will get there, and that's a big difference. All right, Tom, Uren, thank you so much for your excellent work this week, as always, and it was great to talk through it all with you, and we'll do it again next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.